There's a lot of symbolism in Ferris's room, and a lot of it is actually, it seemed to be sort of a cowboys and Indians kind of theme that runs through a lot of the items. The lamps on either side of his bed, there are these, kind of parchment lamps that have wagon wheel scenes on them. There's the wagon wheel chair. And then there's this blanket on his bed, which at first I thought was maybe like some sort of 80s fleece blanket, kind of a vaguely Navajo pattern to it. But I realized was actually a 1940s camp blanket. The pastel colors are what threw me off because they looked really 80s. Those camp blankets were all done in those kinds of faded pinks and blues, and that was very frustrating because I thought, well, then I'll find a camp blanket just like it. Well, I don't think there are two camp blankets that are the same. And I ended up ultimately going with just a crappy fleece blanket. The way I arranged the bed, it was all kind of crumpled up, so you couldn't tell. Hopefully nobody else was too upset about that. I spent a lot of time looking for a mannequin that looked like it, 50s looking mannequin. It had kind of painted hair, and I just couldn't find anything like it. So I knew I didn't want it to have actual hair. It needed to have molded hair. I ended up finding a guy in North York that had mannequins and had some dusty old crappy warehouse and a million things. He tried to sell me like 20 different mannequins, and none of them I liked. And I saw this one, and he couldn't believe that I just wanted the torso. It really bothered him that I didn't want the legs. And anyway, so I took it back, and it was white, and I painted it. And we actually didn't end up finishing painting it because it was such a last minute thing that we were putting it together. But we managed to rig it up so that, if the door opened, that it would move. And that was one of those elements that I think everybody expected to find. I think people really fixated on that mannequin. And in a way, the mannequin is like a character in the movie, right? There's so much suspense built around, is this mannequin going to reveal itself? So that's why I think it was important that, of course, that the mannequin was there and that it was rigged up properly. And so we managed to make it work. The Bryan Ferry poster was one of the posters that also had existed, or at least I could find evidence of its existence. I think it came with a 7-inch from like Japan or something like that. By the time that we started to create the posters, I realized that I'm just not going to get it. And so we recreated that as well. And that one was a complicated one because it's not like it was geometric or something that we could just create ourselves. We had to get all the elements. So I bought, again, all the albums and anything that had any of the artwork that we could find. And then the designer figured out a font that worked. And so we recreated it as best we could. And it's a really central element because you see it in the movie a lot. It's right over Ferris's bed. Bryan Ferry's kind of Ferris's, patron saint, right? We had to nail the Bryan Ferry poster. Interestingly, there's pictures of Bryan Ferry all over his room, which I thought was kind of interesting for a teenager, a guy who's, 16, 17 years old, to be so obsessed with Bryan Ferry of all the 80s icons. But anyway, that was the story of that. So the Cabaret Voltaire poster is probably one of the more coveted items in the room. I had a lot of people write to me when I was crowdsourcing for all of these items saying, if you ever find that Cabaret Voltaire poster, let me know, or I'll buy it from you, or whatever. It's very visible in the room, and like many elements in the room, really just doesn't exist. You can't find this poster. I couldn't even find pictures of the poster. I just knew that, what I could see in the movie. And so that poster we ended up recreating, and I had an amazing graphic designer, Natasha Leung, and I bought all the singles and albums and everything that I could find that had elements that I knew were in the poster, and she recreated them as faithfully as we could to the movie. And I think it turned out great. So yeah, the Cupid doll, one of those elements that I didn't figure out in time for the Toronto iteration of the room, but I did figure it out in time for Chicago. It's one of those little fuzzy items in the background that you don't really notice. I don't think it was ever in focus in the movie, but I ended up figuring out what it was and ordered it from eBay. The timeline was so tight, I had to have it delivered to the Virgin Hotel in Chicago where I was doing the room, and it was one of those last little final touches, and that's the thing is I sort of felt like I never wanted to give up on making it as good as possible. And so I kept looking for items right up until the very end so that I could kind of complete the picture as well as possible. The Simple Minds poster I know did exist, and I'd found evidence of one having been sold like 3 years before, which was very frustrating because it made me realize, okay, it exists. It's in the world somewhere. Like with most of the items in the room, it just couldn't be found. And so again, I bought an album that had some of the elements on it, and my designer just simply recreated it. Thankfully, it was a very graphic piece, so she was able to come up with a fairly good rendering of it. So when I did the room in Toronto, one of the things that literally up to the wire that I hadn't found was the life preserver that went around the deer head. And I felt that it was a really important item. It wasn't just a deer head, it was a deer head wearing a pig nose and a life preserver. And I'd found one that was okay, but it was red, and I knew that the one in the movie was orange. 2 days before the event, I got an email saying, hey, I have exactly the life preserver that you want. And I was like, what? But I'm in California. And I said, can I give you a FedEx number? And you sent it. And this guy FedExed it to the hotel, and it came the morning of the event that we were opening. And the best feeling in the world was taking off that crappy red one and putting the orange one on. And it was literally just the most perfect moment where it was, again, like a cherry on top. And the room looked perfect to me. Before that, it just hadn't seemed right. Funny how the littlest, tiniest details are really what makes the thing work. The EMU2 synthesizer is kind of one of the more iconic items in Ferris's room. As you'll remember, Ferris sits there when he's on the phone with one of the girls at school, and he's pretending to be sick, and he's pressing all the keys, and it's making him sound like he's coughing. And I think at the end it sounds like a toilet flushing or something. So I wanted to find that synthesizer, and of course I wanted it to also do all the things that Ferris's synthesizer did. Those synthesizers were very fragile, and they didn't fare very well through the ages. So I ended up finding a broken one, meaning it didn't work. It looked perfect, and I had it sent from California up here. Anyway, it was a really important element of the room, and without it, I just don't think that it would have felt like Ferris's room. That synthesizer was made famous by bands like Depeche Mode and Toto, in fact. Toto, interestingly enough, was apparently the previous owner of this synthesizer. It actually has a little piece of tape on the side that says the word Toto on it. And it was rumored that it may have been used on the album Thriller, because there was some connection between Toto's equipment and the album Thriller by Michael Jackson. So I like to think that it's a very famous one, maybe makes up for the fact that it doesn't work. As with many of the items in Ferris's room, I realized that his stereo, much like his computer and his synthesizer, was worth a lot of money, even to this day. I sort of assumed that it was going to be some little Sony, maybe it cost me a few $100 at a vintage store, and turns out that it is a highly collectible Carver stereo system and an audio source equalizer. It's sort of a coveted equalizer because it had what the Ferris nerds would call the dancing lights. I don't know, it's a really beautiful thing, like if you're into that kind of thing. So I had to find the exact same one. That proved to be very difficult, again, because this particular equalizer was so coveted and loved because of the dancing lights. So I found one like it, I bought that, and then I found the right one and I bought another one. And that was where, you get to visually see the snores that were playing in the room to fool Ferris's parents. And so my tech wizard, Nathan Whitford of Urban Visuals, he helped me to make sure that the snores played through the equalizer so that the lights danced when the snores came up. And that was a very special element to the room. Any kid in the 80s will tell you that MTV was like the coolest thing ever. And, we're from Canada, and of course we didn't get it here. And some friends of mine, their parents had it because they had, all the extended channels. My family did not. And so one of the things I loved so much in the movie were these fabulous station IDs. And so I wanted to include them in the room somehow, even though, they kind of happen within a sequence. It's not like they were playing all the time, but I really wanted them to play. And so I found those particular station IDs, I found them in some YouTube clips and edited them together to be the ones that were in the movie. And then I had my friend Nathan Whitford, who's, I always say, is my, electronics wizard, and I had him figure out how to rig up this old TV to play these station IDs on an MP3 player. And so it was just kind of to add a kinetic element in the room that I think people would love. When I did the room in Chicago and when I did the room in Toronto, each had a different horse chair. And the horse chair, when I was in Toronto, was one of the last things that I hadn't found. They're a very obscure kind of furniture called wagon wheel furniture from, I think, the 1950s. And I'd found some, in like Texas and things like that on, secondhand sites, but there was no way I was going to be able to ship a giant chair all the way to Canada. Days before the event, I ended up seeing a very similar looking chair at a secondhand store in Brantford, Ontario. It was upholstered a little differently, but it really had the same kind of feeling, the same shape. It was actually a rocking chair, just the same as the horse chair that was in the movie. And I brought it all the way back to Toronto, barely fit in the car. And I thought, my mother-in-law is really good at upholstering things. And so I thought I'd casually mention it to her that I had this chair, but it wasn't quite right. And I was going to, figure out a way to kind of paint it or do something. And she kindly offered to reupholster the whole chair with a horse applique, just like in the movie. When I was heading to Chicago, somebody reached out to me a few days before the event saying, hey, if you're still looking for the horse chair, I have one. On one of the days that we were setting up, I drove out to Cary, Illinois, and met this woman, and she had this chair, which she had found in the garbage. So it was an actual real wagon wheel chair. It was a little different color. It was brown, like kind of a caramel brown, whereas the one in the movie was like an off-white. But hey, the fact that it was a real wagon wheel chair was like a big high-five moment for all of us. So that was a wonderful thing. One of the key elements of Ferris's room, as far as I was concerned, was his computer. There's an entire scene built around Ferris changing his absence days on his home computer to his school computer, which I remember as a kid being like, how on earth do you do that? I mean, the thought that you could make something happen in another computer from your own computer was a foreign idea at the time for me. I really wanted to find the same computer that he had. It was an IBM 5150, a very state-of-the-art computer at the time. I thought, naively that I could just buy it at a Value Village or a Salvation Army. That was wrong. And I ended up finding it and borrowing it at the very generous gesture of a guy named Sid Bolton, who runs the Personal Computer Museum in Brantford, Ontario. Never would have thought to look in Brantford to see if I could find this computer. But literally, I walked into this guy's museum and he allowed me to walk out with the IBM 5150 computer, which Sid had programmed for me on a floppy disk to have Ferris's report card with his absence days counting down, just like it did in the movie. And that was probably one of the most special elements of the room that we were able to pull off.